Perhaps the greatest legacy of Tony Blair was his relentless march through the institutions, whereby he filled them with like-minded people who understood the new Labour agenda. And it seems his protégé, Sir Keir Starmer, intends to be no different. Speaking at the Civil Society Summit, he said the Tories seem set on sabotaging civil society to save their own skins, before making a defence of the National Trust. So are the so-called culture wars the mere figment of the Tories' fevered imaginations, or has liberal groupthink infiltrated our institutions? Well, I'm joined now by the former director of Restore Trust, Zewditu Gebreyohanes, as well as my panel, communication officer at the Institute for Economic Affairs, Reem Ibrahim, and the author and broadcaster, Amy Nicole Turner. Well, Zewditu, let me turn to you first, because you ran Restore. Is Keir Starmer right that actually the National Trust is being brave and forward-looking, and that it's right that we should ignore our history and say that all these people were dreadful?
No. In the first place, I would say that actually what's happened in terms of the culture wars with the National Trust is a mere symptom of much greater issues, which is ultimately these issues are about democracy and accountability, which have sadly been undermined by the current leadership of the National Trust. But the culture wars there have been started by the leadership. They're not of the Tories making, as Starmer tried to imply. And in fact, I know you're a Conservative politician, but I would say it would have been good if the government had done more to try and put an end to this, because it's outside the Trust's remit, statutory remit, and Parliament has oversight of the Trust. But no, I mean, doing things like promoting a divisive book called Green Unpleasant Land, and having a colonial countryside project which brings in children to explore colonial histories at the expense of all other aspects of property's history, I think is quite divisive and controversial.
It's just a very odd thing to do. The National Trust is there to maintain great historic buildings that were very often given to them by the families who built them. And apart from anything else, it seems slightly bad manners then to trash the families who gave you these fantastic properties.
Yes, and it's also strange because it's not as though, I mean, the National Trust argue that they're bringing more history to these places and we all want more history. And of course, I'm sure you would agree, I definitely would agree, that it was very interesting to have more history. Unfortunately, this is very bad history. They're not using historians. They're bringing in people like, English academics, or people who have, who are trendy for other reasons, and bring them to front campaigns which are essentially about virtue signalling rather than anything else.
And Amy, Keir Starmer saying the Tories are fighting the culture wars. Actually, it's, dare I say, you who started it, isn't that right?
Well, I think it was Lee Anderson who said that the next general election will be fought on culture wars, and aren't we seeing that come to fruition? But I think when you take aim at something like the National Trust, which is quintessentially British, it's like taking aim at the Spice Girls or Walker's Crisps. Just don't do it, because it's not going to end with any popularity gain. And it hasn't. At the moment, the National Trust has 1 million more visitors subscribing than last year, and it's actually really cheap to be a member. I looked up today, it's £7 a month, which is an absolute bargain. And for that, I want to know more rather than less, and whether some of it might be uncomfortable, the truths about some of the colonial history of these properties. Well, yeah, sometimes
but it's not uncomfortable,
the truth
it's great.
is uncomfortable.
We ran the world brilliantly.
And we want
we
to
were
hear
marvellous
about
at it. Shouldn't we be proud of that? And every time we go to a National Trust property, be playing Rule Britannia in our car radiogram.
But we should be realistic about some of the histories of these properties. When I'm standing in one, I want to know how it came to be able that they could buy that. I want to know the history of the people that lived there and the stories behind it.
But you don't want to know it in a purgative way, do you? That these are all bad people whose pictures should have moustaches drawn on them.
I don't think that's what's happening, is it?
Well, and also I don't know, we better ask Zewditu.
But it's part of the National Trust's
remit
remit to maintain and perpetuate a historical accuracy of these properties. That's part of what they're supposed to do. So surely,
but they're not being historically accurate. It would have been very good if they had been historically accurate and if they had been bringing in good historians. When you turn away, at last year's elections, celebrated historian, two historians, Andrew Jimson and Jonathan Sumption ran, and neither of them were even interviewed, let alone being chosen as the National Trust recommended candidates. What do you say of an institution that's cast aside people like that, even for interview?
Well, let me bring Reem in.
So I think in the wider context of the culture wars and the way in which it's being fought, the way in which it's being fought, the National Trust is just another third sector organisation that has been permeated and taken over by this kind of sort of social justice warrior ideology. And look, I mean, I think that it's an independent organisation. As far as I'm aware, they don't receive any taxpayer money. So I do think that what's primarily important is that the members of the National Trust, if they are upset by these particular permeances with regard to the culture war, what they should be doing is making that clear. Now, if we want to win the culture war, and if we think that actually the sort of conservative values are the way forward, what we should be doing is being as loud as the left. Unfortunately, the left are winning the culture war because they're much louder than we are.
So come on, Amy, you're the clever one. You're winning the culture war. Tony Blair set it up to
Can I tell
institute lefties into all these positions. Your side has got a grip on our nation.
Here's the truth. There is no culture war. Boom, bombshell. And that's
Keir
the truth.
Starmer now says there is. Your mate Keir now saying there is one.
What's the key? Why did Keir Starmer bring up the culture wars today? It's because your side are using it as a distraction from what really matters: the economy, health,
well, from interest
education.
rates about to come down, taxes about to come down, the economy growing when Germany's in recession.
If we continue to constantly talk about the National Trust and 45,000 people coming across the channel constantly, and we don't talk about growth, we don't talk about health,
Amy.
then where's the long-term plan? All you're going to do is divide people for a temporary, short-term kick that's only going to impress a few people.
I don't buy this argument that the culture war is about short-term divisiveness. I do think that often the culture war is very difficult to fight in that respect. I do think that the economy is the primary issue here. I do think that inflation and the tax cuts are the primary issues that we should be talking about. But we cannot take away from the fact that our institutions are being permeated by this kind of ideology. Why are the National Trust spending huge amounts of money training their staff on unconscious bias?
OK, well, Zewditu, you can tell us that.
Well, I was just going to say one thing. With the distraction, I think actually it's the National Trust leadership who have deliberately used these, they've been saying, oh, look, we're doing this for inclusivity, diversity and so on. And actually they're trying to take away from the fact that they've been undermining democracy and accountability, which I think are much bigger issues. And that's what's led to them being able to quash the members and quash dissent from members. I think that's a real distraction here.
And Amy, that's really important, isn't it? Because the National Trust had a pretty dodgy voting system where you could press a button to vote for all their candidates, and if you wanted to vote for anybody else, you had to wade through mounds of online paperwork.
I know that the National Trust has been a thorn in your side for quite a while now, but the truth is that there are record numbers of malnutrition in this country at the moment. That's the type of thing that people want to talk about. We don't want to talk about National Trust. We're quite happy with it. Let's leave it alone.
Why is Keir Starmer talking about this then?
Because he's used it as a point to highlight how ridiculous conservative politics has become. The fact that you're taking aim at the RNLI, the National Trust. These are beloved British institutions. Leave them alone and let's focus on something real, some unity, something we can move forward with.